David had not expected his journey through the outer sectors to lead him to such a quiet place. His ship had been following an old star chart when he drifted off course and descended toward a green world filled with wide valleys and silver rivers that stretched like threads of light across the land. At first glance, the planet seemed untouched by war or industry, a place where nature itself ruled. He landed near a ridge where the grass grew tall and the air felt fresh, thinking it might only be a stop to rest and check his navigation. But as he walked farther from his ship, he began to hear voices, small and high-pitched, carried across the wind. Curious, he followed the sound until he came upon a village unlike anything he had seen. The houses were carved into great roots of trees, their walls shining faintly as if painted with resin, and between them moved people no taller than his waist. Their bodies were lean, their eyes large, glowing faintly in the shade, and their clothing was woven from fibers of leaves. They looked at him with surprise and fear, children darting behind their parents, while the elders whispered to each other. David raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. He had traveled across many worlds and seen many faces, but never such small and delicate people living so openly with the land. The silence between them was broken when a loud cry echoed from the far side of the village. David turned quickly and saw a group of larger figures rushing in. These were raiders, taller than the little people, but still shorter than him, their armor pieced together from scrap metal, their weapons sharp and cruel. The little villagers scattered in panic, mothers pulling their children into the huts, elders trying to shield the younger ones. The raiders laughed as they smashed baskets, tore through woven walls, and shouted demands in a harsh language that David could partly understand. They wanted food, tribute, and servants, and the fear in the eyes of the little villagers told him this was not the first time such attacks had happened. David's chest tightened as he stood watching. He knew he was an outsider here and had no right to interfere in the customs of others, but the sight of the weak being trampled by the strong filled him with anger. He had seen cruelty before on other worlds, but here it felt sharper, as if the innocence of the small people made the violence unbearable. He looked at his sidearm, a weapon he had carried only for defense, and felt the decision forming inside him. He could walk away and return to his ship, leaving these people to their fate, or he could act and risk drawing the attention of raiders upon himself. The choice came quickly when one of the raiders grabbed a child by the arm and raised a blade to frighten him. Without another thought, David moved forward. His long stride covered the ground quickly, and before the raider could react, David's hand shot out and pulled the child away. The raider stumbled back, shocked by the sudden appearance of a tall human towering over them. The other raiders turned and muttered in surprise, but their shock turned to anger within seconds. They raised their weapons and began to circle him, their leader barking orders. David knew he could not win by brute strength alone. He crouched slightly, keeping his stance wide, and waited for the first move. One raider rushed at him with a spear, but David caught the shaft and twisted, pulling the weapon away and striking with the butt of it to knock the attacker down. Another swung a jagged blade, but David ducked and pushed him back with a heavy kick. The little villagers peeked from their hiding places, watching the scene unfold, their eyes wide with wonder. They had never seen anyone stand up to the raiders with such courage. The fight spread across the village square, David using his height and strength to turn the raiders' attacks against them. He grabbed stones from the ground and threw them with force, striking their armor and breaking their lines. He used his arms to push two at once into a pile of broken baskets, then rolled aside to avoid a spear thrust. It was not graceful, but it was effective, and his sheer determination drove the raiders into confusion. They had come expecting easy prey, not a defender who fought with the fury of a storm. Finally, their leader called for retreat, cursing loudly. as he saw his men bruised and scattered. They pulled back, shouting threats about returning with greater numbers, and vanished into the trees beyond the village. David stood breathing heavily, his clothes torn, his arms scraped, but the child he had saved clung to his leg and looked up at him with wide shining eyes. Slowly, the villagers emerged, their fear turning into awe. Some whispered to each other, pointing at him as if he were a figure from legend. The elders approached carefully, their leader an old man with a staff, who raised his head to meet David's gaze. The old man spoke in broken words of a language David partly knew. He thanked him, calling him a giant friend, a protector who had driven away the shadows. David shook his head and tried to explain he had only acted because it was right, but his words were met with cheers from the villagers. Children gathered around him, pulling at his hands, their eyes filled with admiration. Women brought him bowls of fruit, men patted his arms with respect, and the elder raised his staff high and declared him a guardian sent by the stars. David felt uneasy with the attention, but he could not deny the warmth of their gratitude. As night fell and fires were lit across the village, he sat with them and listened to their songs, hearing their voices rise like bells in the air. Yet even as he shared their food and laughter, a thought lingered in his mind. The raiders would surely return, and the next time they might come in greater strength. He wondered if his path had just shifted forever, binding him to these little people and their fragile world. The night had passed with the sound of songs and small drums, echoing across the trees, and when the morning light touched the roofs of the tiny houses, the whole village seemed alive with renewed spirit, as if a shadow had been lifted from their hearts. David awoke on a bed woven from thick grass inside one of their larger huts, his shoulders still sore from the fight, but his mind clear. He stepped outside and saw the little people already gathering in the open square, carrying baskets of fruit and jars of water, placing them neatly in front of him as offerings. He tried to wave them off gently, explaining that he needed no reward. But they insisted, their eyes shining with respect. The elder, who had introduced himself as Rollo, came forward leaning on his staff and greeted him warmly. He told David, in slow and careful words, that the village had lived in fear for many seasons. The raiders came often, taking food and breaking what they could not carry, and the villagers had learned to survive by hiding and yielding. Never before had anyone stood for them, and never before had the raiders been driven back so swiftly. Rollo said that the courage of one man had given them hope, and hope was a gift more precious than anything they could grow or gather. David listened with patience, his eyes moving across the villagers who watched him with admiration. He felt their trust pressing upon him, and though he had acted on instinct, he now understood the weight of what he had done. By defending them, he had crossed a line between visitor and protector, and in their hearts he had become more than just a wanderer. Part of him wanted to remind them that he was only one man and could not stay forever. Yet another part of him wondered if leaving them now would be the same as betraying them. He remained silent, not knowing which thought to trust. As the day went on, David walked through the village with the children following close behind him. They showed him their gardens where tiny plants glowed softly in the shade, their water wheels turning on clear streams, and their storage huts filled with dried roots and fruits. He saw how carefully they lived with the land, wasting nothing, taking only what they needed, and he respected their way of life. Yet he also saw the cracks left behind by raids, broken fences, scarred walls, and eyes that carried old fear. He realized that even if he fought for them once, they would always remain vulnerable unless they learned to defend themselves. At noon, Rollo called the people together beneath the largest tree at the center of the village. He raised his staff and spoke in a clear voice that carried across the crowd. He declared that their people owed David more than words, and that no gift of food or craft could match the gift he had given them. According to their old law, such a savior must be bound to their tribe. not as a guest who might leave, but as kin who would share their fate. The crowd cheered, clapping their small hands together, while David stood unsure of what the elder meant. Rollo continued and explained that the custom of their people was simple yet sacred. When a stranger defended them with such bravery, they would offer him a bond deeper than friendship, a bond that could not be broken. This bond was made by joining him to their family through marriage to one of their daughters. David froze when he heard the words, certain at first that he had misunderstood. The villagers around him looked up with eager eyes, waiting for his acceptance. While he searched for the right response, he tried to explain that he respected their way, but that he was different, that he came from a people far away where such things did not happen so quickly. Yet the villagers did not seem to understand his hesitation. To them this was not strange but honorable, a gift that made him one of their own. The younger women smiled shyly, the children laughed and teased each other, and the men nodded with approval. For them this was not a burden, but the highest sign of gratitude. David felt a knot forming in his chest. He did not want to insult them by refusing, yet he could not imagine himself bound in such a way. His mind filled with questions of what it even meant to marry one of these small people, what kind of life it would bring, and whether he could ever truly fit into their world. He looked at Rollo, who waited calmly, his staff planted firmly on the ground, his eyes steady as if he already knew what David would choose. The pressure grew heavier when some of the villagers began chanting softly, repeating his name, their voices like a tide rising around him. David raised his hand to quiet them, his face serious. He told them in plain words that he could not make such a decision lightly, that he needed time to understand what it meant. Rollo listened and nodded slowly, agreeing that such matters should not be rushed, but his tone made it clear that the tribe already considered the bond inevitable. As the day drew into evening, David sat alone near the edge of the village, looking at the horizon where the forest stretched into shadow. He thought of his ship resting quietly beyond the ridge, waiting to take him away, and he wondered if walking back to it now would be the easiest path. Yet when he looked over his shoulder, he saw the children playing in the square, their laughter free for the first time in years, and he knew that his choice had already tied him to them in ways he could not undo. His thoughts were broken when Rollo joined him, sitting slowly on the grass with his staff across his lap. The elder spoke softly, saying that he understood David's hesitation. He explained that the bond was more than a marriage in the human sense. It was a promise that the tribe would be his family and he would be theirs. The idea of a mini-wife, as he put it with a slight smile, was less about size or shape and more about unity, about making him a true part of their people. David listened, realizing that behind the strange custom lay a deep desire to never be abandoned again. Before he could answer, the night air was cut by a distant horn. Both men turned their heads sharply, and in the far darkness the faint glow of torches moved between the trees. The raiders were returning sooner than expected, their promise of revenge already at hand. Rollo's eyes grew grave as he stood, leaning heavily on his staff. He said that the choice would have to wait, for the tribe needed their defender once again. David rose, his body tense, knowing the moment of decision was drawing nearer with every step of the enemy. The glow of torches in the distance grew brighter with every passing moment, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the sound of drums echoing from the forest. The little villagers gathered quickly in the square, their faces pale with fear, children clinging to their mothers while the men tried to steady their trembling hands. David stood at the edge of the crowd watching the horizon with narrowed eyes. He could feel the tension rising around him like a storm ready to break. The raiders had wasted no time in returning, and this time they came not to take but to destroy. Rollo raised his staff and spoke to his people with calm strength, reminding them that they were not alone, that they had a defender now, and that courage was stronger than fear. His words steadied some hearts, but many still looked at David as if their survival depended entirely upon him. David felt the weight of those gazes pressing into his chest. He had fought for them once, but now they seemed to believe he could do so again against greater numbers. He clenched his fists, knowing he could not walk away even if doubt filled his mind. As the torches drew closer, David began to think quickly. He asked the men of the village what tools and weapons they had. They showed him small spears and slings, nothing strong enough to hold against armored raiders. David frowned, realizing that courage alone would not win this fight. He told them they must use the village itself as a shield, turning every tree, every rock, and every stream into a weapon. He pointed to the tall roots surrounding the huts and explained how they could block paths, how the villagers could throw stones from above, how water from the river could be used to slow the raiders' charge. The little men listened carefully, their eyes wide as he spoke, for no one had ever taught them to fight in such a way. The women joined in, gathering baskets of stones, filling clay jars with sand to throw into enemy eyes, and tying ropes between trees to trip advancing feet. The children were sent into the deepest huts for safety, guarded by the oldest elders, while the rest of the tribe prepared for the battle. David moved among them, showing how to hold their spears, how to strike together rather than alone, and how to stand firm even when fear whispered to run. His voice was steady, his gestures clear, and slowly he saw fear turn into determination in their faces. Still, even as he trained them, David felt the weight of Rollo's earlier words about the bond, the promise of a mini-wife. It echoed in his mind as if it were tied to every step he took. He wondered if the villagers' willingness to follow his lead now was not only because of his strength, but also because they already considered him part of their family. The thought troubled him. Was he fighting for them because it was the right thing, or because he was being drawn deeper into a role he had not chosen? His heart battled with itself even as his hands prepared them for war. The sound of drums grew louder, and then the raiders appeared at the edge of the clearing. They were more numerous this time, their armor glinting with torchlight, their weapons raised high. Their leader shouted a challenge, his voice filled with rage, promising to tear down the village and grind its people into the dirt. The villagers trembled but did not run. They looked to David, who stood tall at the front, spear in hand, his shoulders squared. He shouted back, telling the raiders they would find no easy prey here, only resistance. His voice carried through the night like a thunderclap, and the villagers answered with their own cries. Thin but fierce, the raiders charged, their boots pounding against the earth, and the first clash erupted at the outer line of huts. David led the defense, striking with precision, knocking aside blades, and pushing enemies into traps the villagers had set. Ropes caught ankles, jars of sand blinded eyes, stones rained from above, and spears jabbed from hidden corners. The raiders howled in anger as the little people fought with surprising unity. For the first time, the tribe stood not as scattered victims but as a wall of defiance. David fought like a storm among them, his size and strength turning the tide wherever he moved. Yet the battle was not easy. He felt the sting of blades against his arms, the burn of exhaustion in his chest, but he pushed forward again and again. Every time he looked around, he saw villagers holding the line, and in their eyes he saw the trust they had given him. That trust was heavier than any blade, heavier even than his own fear of binding himself to their world. Hours seemed to pass in moments as the fight raged, and at last the raiders began to falter. Their leader shouted angrily, trying to rally them, but the sight of their fallen companions and the stubborn strength of the small villagers broke their spirit. Slowly they pulled back into the trees, retreating once more into the night, leaving behind the echo of their rage and the mark of their failure. When the last torch disappeared into the forest, the village square filled with cries of victory. The little people embraced each other, tears of relief streaming down their cheeks, and they crowded around David with cheers. Children ran to him, climbing onto his arms, while women pressed his hands with gratitude. Men raised their broken spears high, shouting his name again and again. Rollo stepped forward, his old eyes wet with pride, and lifted his staff toward the sky. He declared that their survival had been sealed not only by their courage, but by the bond that had already begun between them and their defender. David stood breathing heavily, his body aching, but his mind turned inward. The victory was real. Yet the elder's words deepened the conflict in his heart. He knew they saw him not only as a warrior but as family, bound to them through the promise of marriage to one of their own. He respected their tradition, but a part of him still resisted. The idea, he had not come here to settle, nor to wed, but to explore and move on. And yet, as he looked at their joyful faces, he realized leaving would break them in a way worse than any raid. That night, as the fires burned brighter than ever before, the villagers danced and sang around him. Rollo sat beside him and told him that after such a victory, there could be no doubt. The bond must be sealed soon, for it was the way of their ancestors, and it was the only way to make him truly one of them. David listened in silence, staring into the flames, torn between the path of his own people and the path that these small hearts had opened before him. His answer remained unspoken, hidden even from himself, but he knew the moment to decide was fast approaching, and no battle of blades could compare to the battle already raging within his soul. The morning after the second battle came with a strange silence that spread across the village like a heavy fog. The villagers moved carefully through the square, repairing their broken walls and gathering the remains of what had been smashed. But their voices were hushed as if each of them feared that speaking too loudly might draw the enemy back again. David stood on the ridge above the river, looking toward the forest. He knew in his heart that the raiders would not let this end so easily. Twice now their pride had been broken by him and by the courage of the villagers, and men who thrived on fear and violence would never allow such defeat to remain. They would gather more of their kind. They would come armed with heavier weapons, and when they did, it would not be for food or tribute, but for revenge. Rollo came to stand beside him, leaning on his staff as always, his eyes steady despite the weight of years. He told David that the tribe believed the third attack would be the final one, that the raiders would pour all their strength into crushing them once and for all. He spoke without fear, as if the fate of the tribe had already been decided by the stars. David listened in silence before turning to the elder and saying that if this was to be the last battle, then they must prepare as never before. He could not promise them safety, but he could promise them a chance to stand strong. Rollo nodded and said that the tribe trusted him not only as a warrior but as kin, and soon their customs would make that bond unbreakable. David gave no answer, though his heart beat heavily at the thought. The next days were filled with tireless work. David organized the villagers into groups, teaching them to move in formation, to strike together, to retreat and regroup rather than scatter. He showed them how to sharpen their small spears with fire, how to dig pits and cover them with branches, how to stretch nets across paths to trap enemies, and how to use the high trees as towers for slings and arrows. The little men and women trained until their hands blistered, yet not once did they complain. Their fear had turned into determination, and David could see in their faces the fire of people who had decided that this time they would not bend. At night he sat by the fires with them, listening to their stories of ancestors who had once stood against giants, of songs that spoke of courage hidden in the smallest hearts. Children gathered near him, their eyes wide, asking him to tell of his own world. He spoke simply, of wide oceans and tall cities, of skies filled with machines that crossed the stars. They listened in wonder, their imaginations glowing, and he felt a strange warmth grow inside him. It was the warmth of belonging, something he had not felt in many years of wandering. Yet every time he looked at Rollo, he saw the expectation in the elder's eyes. The promise of the bond, the talk of the mini-wife, lingered like a shadow. He did not know if he could ever cross that line, but he understood now that the tribe's trust in him was bound tightly to that custom. To them it was not only about marriage, but about a vow that he would never leave them. The thought weighed on him like armor too heavy to bear, and yet when he imagined walking away, the image of the children's laughter made such an idea unbearable. On the fourth night, the horn sounded again, deeper and louder than before. From the forest came a sea of torches, more than twice as many as the last raid, and the earth itself seemed to tremble under the march of so many feet. The raiders had gathered their full strength. They carried heavy axes, stronger armor, and beasts harnessed to drag logs for smashing huts. Their leader rode at the front, shouting curses, vowing to burn the village to ash. The little villagers trembled, but did not break. They lined up with their spears, their slings ready, their nets stretched, their traps hidden. David moved among them, his voice calm, telling them to remember what they had practiced, to trust themselves, to fight not as prey but as defenders of their home. The first clash shook the night. Raiders stormed into the traps, falling into pits, tripping over ropes, stumbling into nets. Villagers rained stones from above, striking helmets and armor. Spears darted from shadows, hitting legs and arms. David himself met the front line, wielding a spear in one hand and a shield of wood in the other, his body moving with fierce precision. He blocked, struck, pushed, and guided, his tall form a beacon in the chaos. Everywhere he moved, courage followed, and the little people fought with hearts that no longer knew fear. The battle grew fierce. Raiders broke through lines, tearing at huts, but villagers countered with fire and stones. David shouted orders, pulling fighters into new formations, sending runners to signal where help was needed. His voice carried above the screams, keeping the tribe together like a single living shield. He clashed with the raider leader at last, their weapons striking with sparks, the leader snarling with rage at the human who had humiliated him twice. The duel raged in the center of the square, each blow echoing against the huts. David's muscles burned, but he refused to yield. With a sudden surge, he twisted the raider's arm, struck with the butt of his spear, and sent the leader crashing to the ground. The sight broke the spirit of the raiders, and slowly they began to retreat, dragging their wounded, leaving behind their dead. When the last of them vanished into the forest, the village erupted with cries of triumph. The battle was over, the enemy broken, and for the first time the villagers believed the raids would never return. They surrounded David with tears and laughter, lifting their small voices in praise. Rollo came forward, his eyes glowing with pride, and raised his staff high. He declared that the tribe had not only found freedom, but had found family, and that their savior had proven himself one of them in blood, in spirit, and in bond. The crowd cheered, chanting David's name, while the elder spoke the words that sealed the custom. The bond would be fulfilled. The hero would take a mini-wife and be tied to the tribe forever. David stood in the middle of the celebration, his chest heaving from battle, his arms heavy, his heart torn between two worlds. He looked at the villagers who saw him not as an outsider but as kin, who now expected him to honor their law. He looked at the children laughing, the women smiling, the men raising broken spears with pride. His soul swayed like a ship between waves, caught between the life he had known and the new life that now reached for him. The battle had been won, but another battle awaited, one that no weapon could resolve, only the choice of his own heart. The fires of celebration burned long into the night, their warm light spilling across the square where the villagers sang and danced with voices stronger than ever before. The fear that had haunted them for so many seasons was gone, replaced with the joy of survival and the strength of unity. For the first time in living memory they felt free, and at the center of their joy stood David, tall among them, his shadow stretching across the ground like a watchful guardian. Yet inside his heart there was no simple joy, for he knew the battle of blades was behind him, but the battle of choice was still before him. Rollo stepped forward, his staff raised high, and his words carried above the laughter. He declared that the old custom must now be fulfilled, that their savior had fought not once but 3 times for their survival, and by their law such bravery could only be honored by binding him to the tribe forever. He spoke of the bond as sacred, as the unbroken chain that had held their people together through ages of struggle. The villagers fell silent at his words, their faces turned toward David, waiting for the answer that would shape not only his future, but theirs as well. David stood in the glow of the flames, his body still sore, his mind heavy. He looked into the eyes of the little people around him. He saw children who no longer trembled in the dark, women whose smiles were no longer shadowed by fear, men who stood taller than before with pride. He knew that their strength had come from within them. Yet he also knew that in their hearts they had tied that strength to him. To leave now would be to tear open a wound deeper than any raid. Yet to stay would mean surrendering the freedom he had carried all his life. The villagers whispered softly, waiting, the tension thick like a rope stretched to breaking. At last, David raised his hand for silence. His voice was steady though his heart raced. He told them that he came from a world far away where bonds were chosen differently, where families were made through time and choice, not through sudden custom. He said he respected their law and he respected their wish, but he could not give himself to something he did not understand. A murmur spread through the crowd, a wave of disappointment, yet David did not stop. He continued, saying that while he could not take a wife in their sense, he would still give them the vow of his heart. He promised that he would remain with them, not as a passing guest, but as a guardian, a teacher, and a brother. He promised that he would fight if danger returned, that he would help them grow strong enough to protect themselves, and that he would never abandon them. The villagers fell silent, listening, their faces filled with confusion. Rollo stepped closer, his old eyes locked on David's. He asked in a low voice if the man refused their gift. David shook his head slowly and said no. He did not refuse, but he wished to honor it in another way. He explained that the bond they offered him was not only about marriage but about unity. To him, unity did not need to be sealed by taking a wife, but could be sealed by choosing to be family in the truest sense. He asked them to accept his vow as equal to their custom, not because he rejected them, but because he wanted to stand with them in a way that was true to both sides. For a long moment there was silence, the villagers looking to their elder for guidance. Rollo's eyes narrowed in thought and then softened. He struck his staff against the ground and declared that the vow had been spoken, and vows of the heart were as binding as vows of marriage. He turned to his people and said that the man was one of them now, not as husband to a single woman, but as kin to all, as brother, as son, as father to their children. The crowd let out a cheer, their disappointment turning into relief, for what mattered was not the form of the bond, but the truth within it. The celebration rose again, this time louder, fuller, as if the village itself had been reborn. Women brought wreaths of woven leaves and placed them on David's shoulders. Children painted his arms with colors of the tribe, and men lifted him onto a wooden seat and carried him through the square. They sang songs of new beginnings, calling him the tall brother, the sky guardian, the flame that had turned fear into strength. David smiled despite the weight in his chest, for though he had not taken their custom fully, he had been accepted. And in that acceptance he felt a warmth deeper than he had known for many years. The days that followed were filled with rebuilding. David worked alongside the villagers, teaching them to craft stronger defenses, to shape their tools into sharper weapons, to stand watch at night, and to send signals through drums. The little people learned quickly, their hands clever and their spirits eager, and soon the village looked less like prey and more like a fortress hidden within the roots of the forest. Children followed him wherever he went, copying his movements, with wooden sticks, laughing as they pretended to fight like him. He taught them with patience, his heart lighter with each day, for he saw in their eyes the promise of a future where they would never again live in fear. Rollo often joined him in the evenings, sitting beside him at the fire. The elders spoke of how their people had been weak for too long, how raids had broken their courage, and how the arrival of one man had changed the tide of their history. He told David that the stars had sent him, that fate itself had guided him here, and David only smiled, saying that perhaps sometimes fate chose strange paths for wanderers. Yet inside he wondered if the elder was right, for he no longer felt like a wanderer but like a man who had found a place worth guarding. Weeks passed, and no sign of the raiders returned. Scouts reported only silence in the woods, and slowly the tribe began to believe that their enemy had been defeated for good. The fear that once haunted every shadow was gone, replaced by laughter and music that filled the nights. The bond had been made not through marriage but through trust, and in every heart David had become family. He still thought of his ship beyond the ridge, waiting silently, its engines cold, but each day he found fewer reasons to return to it. The village, with its small people and their big hearts, had become home in a way no world had ever been before. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and painted the sky in shades of fire, David stood at the edge of the square watching the children chase each other through the grass. A little girl ran up to him, tugging at his hand, and asked if he would tell another story of the oceans of his world. He lifted her gently into his arms, her laughter filling his ears, and in that moment he knew his wandering had ended. He had defended the little aliens, and in return they had given him not just gratitude, but a family, a place, and a future. And so the tale of the giant and the small became part of their songs, a story told around fires for generations, of the human who stood for them and chose to stay, not as master, not as husband, but as brother, protector, and kin. The end.